Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
It is so wonderful to be here and to have the chance to have this conversation. And I am just excited about the opportunity to get to know you a little better and learn more about the journey. And just wondering, um, probably a place to start, but if you could go back, if you could think about,
If I can remember back,
of course, you can remember back the preacher you were at the beginning of your journey. What would you say to that preacher that you sort of maybe wished you had known at that point?
I would say keep living. I, I would say that the accumulation of experience, the change in not only in the world but in the church, I don't think I could say to that young preacher what he could prepare for, because it's something that we never would have envisioned. And I'm not just talking about pandemic wise, but just life and the life of the church and the condition of the world. And we've heard that saying, just keep on living. It is about experiences and being able to grow through one's experiences, and particularly as a preacher, to always ask after, for instance, a sermon is preached, how could I've done better? Which means sometimes you can be very hard on yourself, because you always want to be sure that you're representing God well, that God is pleased. So to me, that's very awesome responsibility and awesome thing to think about. But it also pushes one to want to give God more. If you let me stand one more time, I'll try to do better.
And I imagine that, at least I know for myself, I'm often probably a harder critic than God is.
Yeah.
That God is
All right.
probably a whole lot more gracious than I am on a whole lot.
Which is probably why I don't like to listen to myself. Maybe I should. Maybe it's something it would help me, but I don't want to listen to myself, because I will pick it apart. Maybe too much.
I ended up doing more of that, not because I wanted to, but because I was using other people's sermons in class when I'm teaching. And finally had a student like, how come we're not ever getting to listen to yours? So I've done it more in that context. When I think of my own journey, there are some decisions when I go back and think at the beginning of the journey, that I meant, or some things that I stood on, or some songs at my licensing. They did the song, I decided to make Jesus my choice. And it was a commitment that I was making, but there's a line in it, the hills have been rough and the journey of peace. And at that point, I had not been on a journey long enough for any of that to be testimony. But now, when I hear that, I can really hear that and can really say, yeah, I made that commitment. I really have done those things. It's become testimony. So have there been some commitments that you made early that you sort of lived into?
I'm reminded of a song, a hymn that was sung, which was very traditional at the time. Go preach my gospel, saith the Lord. And when I think about that song, go preach my gospel, I had no idea when it was sung. It was sung in the old meter style of singing, because I grew up in a church of people who had migrated from the South, my dad's church, and so we sang meter songs and songs without instrumental accompaniment. But I had no idea when I heard that song sung what that really meant. Go preach my gospel and all that it entailed. because it involves a lot more than just preparing a sermon, standing in the pulpit and preaching it. A lot more comes with it because there is also, I think, I know a responsibility to live that. And it's always a challenge, I think, for all of us because we are, God does not call angels to preach. He calls flesh and blood, men and women. And calls us out of the midst of a congregation. We are one of the people, and he's called us from where we sit in the congregation to higher ground. And so there is always that sense of more is expected, fairly or not. And we do know that there are people always out there who are critical, not only of the church, but of the preacher as well. And so go preach my gospel is more than words and more than a phrase. It becomes a lifestyle and a life that one is dedicated to. And as I look back, that's all I've ever known. That's all I tried to do. But certainly not easy to do. It's what we are called to do. I think the gospel is larger than those who preach it. But then at what point do we represent it and try to represent it well, even in our flawed condition?
If you had to give your list of the top 10 preachers, and has that list changed over the years?
Top of the list is my father. And I don't say that just because he was my dad, but because he was the model for me. I wouldn't say he was the greatest preacher in an academic sense or in an objective sense, but for me, he was the greatest and the greatest inspiration for me. And a preacher whose gifts were honed in the South, out in the country, in the woods, and preaching that was colorful, imaginative, describing the end time, describing what heaven is like. I can just remember and still hear those cadences, and so I think I've tried to internalize using words that people could see by, not just hear but see. So he would be number one. Gardner C. Taylor, Joseph H. Jackson, who pastored here and was president of the National Baptist Convention. Carolyn Knight, who was professor, I think she's retired now, at ITC and has preached here. My friend Charles Booth, I would put him in that category, him being in my generation. There was a preacher by the name of Sandy F. Ray, who I didn't hear a lot of him. At one time there was the debate, just like if we debate sports heroes today. There was debate, it was Gardner Taylor or Sandy Ray. Two styles of preaching, but very effective in their own way. And again, I think because of the style and the language, the use of the mastery of words. Let me see. I think right here in Philadelphia, William J. Shaw, for me, would be on that top 10 list. Benjamin Mays, and again, such a variety of styles. And a lot of these were influential in my earlier years when William Holmes Borders was a pastor in Pastor Wheat Street in Atlanta, and at the time was probably, along with Gardner Taylor, and Jackson, three most popular black preachers in the country. I would include Benjamin Mays, who was the schoolmaster of the movement and was a great influence in the life of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I would include Martin Luther King Jr. as an effective orator, preacher. If we're talking about influencing me and a style of preaching and the content of preaching, he would be on that list. But that's kind of a sampling.
But you talked about Gardner Taylor and Jackson and I think Woodard of being the most popular Black preachers in their day. And as you said that, I just got curious how, when I think of today, when you think popular, you see them on Facebook, you see them on YouTube, how people get to know who's popular. And just wondering, was it that they were doing lots of revivals around, or how did that popularity get gauged?
Well, through the convention. National Baptist Convention was the place where we heard the greats. Convention is not as it's in decline like everything else is in terms of our denominational bodies in our churches also, but we're excited from year to year to get to the convention and get to Hampton. I should mention Hampton as well, because that's where we heard them. And then whenever they came anywhere in the area, I made sure I was there to hear them. So I've come from Jersey to Philadelphia to hear Caesar Clark at Vine. In those years, he did 2 weeks revival. We whittled it down to 1 week in most of our churches, and then to 3 nights. And I'm at 2 nights now, because the pandemic has dictated some of that. But wherever they were, and particularly eulogies, because Jackson and Taylor were probably called upon to do more eulogies than any other preachers because of who they were and their connection to their conventions. And so if J.H. Jackson was coming to anywhere, Newark, South Jersey, Philadelphia, to eulogize one of the great pastors who had gone to be with the Lord, I was there to hear that. I heard J.H. Jackson eulogize Dr. Carr at Vine Memorial. That's before Reverend Allen came. And Dr. Hoggard at Mount Carmel. I was a student at Crozer. A couple of us students, we drove from Chester to hear him. So it's kind of that trying to absorb and to take in and digest all of that. And I'm not suggesting by any means that they're not great preachers today, because there are many. But in terms of my formative years, those who've informed me and influenced me, those are the ones. And I always ask the question, I've asked it in preaching classes, what is it about that minister that makes him or her effective? As you're listening, style-wise, pulpit-wise, what to you is the attraction? Because I think that's always an interesting question, and how God, it's just like the music in our church. Those of us who want a balanced meal, a diet that includes all types of sacred music. Then in terms of preaching, it's the same thing. And I appreciate styles of preaching other than my own. Sometimes I wish I could do some of that other style, but I'm not envious of it, because that's not the gift I was given. But I certainly do appreciate it. And I try to bring to monumental preachers of different styles. I don't want to bring preachers here who preach my style of preaching only, but a diverse style, a Bishop Felton, just because I think people deserve to be exposed to different styles of Black preaching, because it's such a rich genre.
And it helps them to be listeners, I would think, of the sermon, not just if all they hear is one style. Then when they hear something different, they would tend to think that's not preaching.
Exactly.
But when they hear a variety, that helps them to understand it, each preacher is different and learning to listen. So I would agree with that. What have you been reading? Or like me, if you do audible books, listening to recently.
Uh, I've been reading really kind of several books, and I have some that I just haven't gotten to yet. One is Jesus and John Wayne. I don't know if you've
I
heard.
don't know that, but I like the
Yeah,
title.
it's a book that traces the the marriage between uh, white conservative Christians and politics,
Wow.
the Republican Party.
Mhm.
That that really didn't begin with Trump or the present day, but all the way back to Eisenhower, um, who invited Billy Graham to the White House against Eisenhower didn't want him particularly. He didn't want for that there to be that connection, but he yielded, and then from that to Reagan to Nixon to Reagan to Bush and moral majority, and so the book is about how that developed and how really uh, the Republican Party became the party of the religious right. And then I like to read biography. So I just finished a book on Mary McLeod Bethune, a book on Howard Thurman, both of them from the same town in Florida, in Daytona. I like to read sermons. Peter Gomes, who was minister at Harvard Chapel, who passed away several years ago. I like to read sermons by him and other preachers. There's also a book that I'm getting ready to read on the rise of the black middle class through the Pullman Porters and that whole movement of a man named Pullman who developed this railroad car, a sleeper,
Right.
and so rich people could
Yeah.
sit up in their own compartments during the day and then sleep at night, and he hired black men to wait on them.
Yes.
But they were paid, well, I mean, what wasn't a great salary, but it was a middle class salary, and that helped to give rise to the middle class. And you have these black men who were dressed in their uniforms, and because railway was the way to travel at the time, they traveled all over the country. Then they go back home and tell stories to their families about their travels. So I'm getting ready to read that, and A. Philip Randolph, who was a part of that union of black porters, and who came up with the idea of a march on Washington years before King in 1941, and he threatened to have that march, and at the last minute, Roosevelt yielded to some of his demands, and he didn't have the march. So it's interesting. I like history. I like biography. That's pretty much what I've been reading. Another book on my old Kentucky home. It's the song that's sung every year at the Kentucky Derby, and it's a racist song, and how the whole thoroughbred industry thrived and survived because of black people, black slaves, who built the country in the first place. But if you've ever driven through parts of Kentucky, the horse stables, you would think they were mansions where people lived. It's
I've
amazing.
Never been to Kentucky.
And the manicured lawn, the grass, the white fence for miles, all of that kept up by black people, historically by black people. That's some of the kind of books that I read when I make myself sit down and read. And once I start, I tend to just keep on reading.
Well, those are exciting. The one on the Pullman porters, I just filed that in my head because I had an uncle who was a Pullman porter.
Really?
Yes. And when you said that, I can remember he'd be gone and on the train, always
Yes.
dressed.
But I think it's called the Rising on the Rails or something like that. I'm bad at remembering titles and authors, but it's about that whole movement.
We talked a lot about preaching, but you've been in ministry a minute. So what is some of the ministry beyond the church walls and beyond the preaching moment? Just a little bit about, your involvement, I know, in the community. I know you've taught. I know you've directed programs. Some of the other things over the 35 years that have just been a part of your ministry.
I think involvement in denominational work, locally and nationally, and you mentioned community. It's always been important to me. When you talk about beyond walls and Jesus' ministry, a lot of time where the people were. And so it's difficult today, I think, in our urban cities, but necessary to try to have some influence in the community, even to the extent sometimes a community may be hostile to the church for whatever reasons. So much concerned about being liked or if we do this, then you're gonna be appreciative enough to come join our church, because that ain't gonna happen. And Jesus understood that in terms of when he offered the cross is when people started to walk away. As long as when he was feeding them, he had multitudes and healing, but to the point where he thought his disciples might consider that, will ye also go away? Especially today with the changing landscape of our communities, and gentrification is real. And I think rather than trying to fight it, we ought to use our influence to make sure that that minorities are treated fairly, so that our communities can still reflect different incomes, so that poor people can still afford to live where they want to live. Make the church a welcoming place for all types of people who are. I mean, you can look around the neighborhood and see that it's not the same neighborhood it was 35 years ago or 10 years ago. And so how do we become a more welcoming church, and at the same time maintain the integrity of the gospel in the Black church? Black church must remain the Black church and cannot compromise who it is and what it is. To use every opportunity that we can to be the church beyond the walls. Education is very something I've always been excited about, and opportunities that have come my way to teach in seminaries at Palmer, Lutheran, because that's something I just love to do. I see such a connection between preaching and teaching.
And that you do well. That you do well. There are people who are entering ministry now. And if you think about when you were entering, do you think it's an easier process to enter now, or a more challenging process to enter now than it was in the past?
Well, challenging today, and maybe in a different way than it was when I entered. But definitely so. The world is more complex. There's an increased secularism among our people. The church is no longer central. Not all, but for so many. When we think about the old Black church, I use that term. But the church was just important. It may still be, but not as important. And there's so many other attractions and toys and things to do that compete with that. And so I think it is a greater challenge. Yes, I do. I do think it's a greater challenge.
And I would agree with you. I mean, I think the whole sense of everybody now has to have their own ministry, and they've got to have. It's just a harder world. I thank you for giving me the opportunity to have time and conversation.
Oh, no, thank you.
I'm grateful for being blessed by your ministry, and pray that we get to be around to celebrate 70th.
But I also thank you, and of course we know that you are a great woman of God and really a member of Monumental and a dear friend of ours. So appreciate this time.
Thank you.
With you.
Thank you.